let's go through it. I'm Chris Ostro, and we're going to do a quick training on just sort of designing and implementing your classroom AI policy, doing this for NAIR, CU RMAC, and couldn't be better timed. I think for most of you, what I was seeing in some of that survey data, classes are starting soon, but not quite yet. So this is the time. So before I get to any actual of the real meat here, though, I want to start off with an AI disclosure statement, right? I'm going to be asking you to lead by example in your own class, and I would be a hypocrite if I didn't lead by my own example here. So, hey, in this talk, every lick of this content was made by little old me, other than two very obvious Gen AI images on slide 12. You have my word. I would not waste your time presenting a talk I could not find the time to make or practice. And I just wanted to lead with that. Hopefully, that gets us all sort of feeling cozy and fun and communal. So, first, let's go over the agenda. Intro, who am I? All that jazz. And then also flip in the mirror. Who are you? Right? I want to see what you're bringing at this, your thoughts on AI use. Then after that, we're going to do a quick discussion of the background, what's changed in the classroom. Look, far be it for me to tell all of you how your jobs have changed. I'm sure you got lots of thoughts, but it helps to at least cover that ground quickly. Then we're going to start looking at policy crafting. What works, what doesn't work, what are some essentials, what are some considerations. And then we're actually going to look at a few good example policies, just very briefly, time permitting, but I think it's nice for me to link these to you. Then we're going to do a quick worksheet exercise to actually get us jump started in making our own policy. Then talking about once you have a good policy, what do you do? Just having a good policy you don't know how to communicate or implement doesn't really go anywhere. So let's do that as well. And then finally, just quick takeaways, quick conclusions before looking at some resources. And then finally, relaxing into a Q&A, which hopefully will be really fun, real cozy. We'll just love chatting. Fingers crossed. But let's keep going. So first, introductions. Who's this guy? Who's this guy talking at you? So, hey, I'm Chris Ostro. I'm an assistant teaching professor for continuing education over here at CU Boulder. And I'm also the AI and learning specialist for the Learning Design Group, which is a course design team, instructional design team housed in the Division of Continuing Education. I also recently published on my classroom approach. There's a link in the chat, but again, I'll drop a link in the chat here as well. Go grab that if you're curious. Give it a gander. That's a deep dive in how I actually run AI in my own course. A few things about me. I'm a professional talker, right? I talk a lot, too much. Some people might even argue. I'm also an instructional designer, but I'm still teaching, right? And I think that's kind of a fun world to exist in. I am seeing crises in my classroom, seeing things break regularly, but then I get to go do a bunch of work, get informed, figure out what best practices are, what's the literature say, work with a team to figure out some solutions. Then I get to go test them in the classroom, which rules. And when it works or doesn't work, I then get to take that stuff back to the team and keep iterating, right? There's something really fun about that role, although I'd be lying if I said it isn't a bunch of work. Or, occasionally I get caught in a pinch because two different people are asking me to get to two different things, either as a designer or as a teacher. Sometimes there's a conflict, but that's life. Beyond that, though, I'm still teaching in person, online, intro and upper levels. And I teach one thing I want to give a caveat here is generally small classes. I teach writing. And, writing classes are generally workshopy, 20 to 25 students. So by all means, if you're having struggles with a bigger lecture setting, I have some tools here that hopefully can help get you started. But I'd be lying if I said that I have a ton of personal experience there. I'm glad to help, but, hopefully these resources are more helpful. I'm also a big research nerd. I run an AI reading group at CU Boulder, and we read a ton of articles. I'm sure a few of those people are here. Hey, y'all. For that end, there are a lot of links in this presentation. Lots of articles just dropped in various slides. I would encourage you to follow up on those. I generally tried to curate pretty good literature there for you. And in terms of my own teaching, I take a real process over product approach. This is true for, I think, most people who teach writing, right? I don't necessarily care as much about the final product. I care about how the student got there. When I ask my students to write me a rhetorical analysis of a Super Bowl ad, I'm not doing it because I'm so excited to learn more about a Super Bowl ad. I'm doing it because there's something about that assignment that when they do it in certain ways, helps them build certain muscles. And that process has been disrupted. I'm also taking what I'd call a real harm reduction approach to AI, right? This is one of those things that people are doing, better or worse. There are lots of risks with it. And I would much rather my students saw me as a reasonable, informed adult they could come talk to and ask questions rather than a person who's just going to get them in trouble, right? And then real finally, I'm what I'd call myself is like an AI realist, very much in this Leon Furr's sort of camp, right? Of like, I see that there are real values in these tools. I see there are very specific ways in which they can be insanely positive. But there are also real negatives that we need to account for. And that takes intentionality. It takes patience. It takes boring stuff like research and making policy, but we have to do it, right? Otherwise, just self-guided use is going to be bad. So that's sort of a little bit about me and the biases I'm bringing in. But I wanted to learn a little bit about you. And I think as we're going through these, most of these things don't have a clear unity. Some of these things, right? I think a lot of people are pretty okay with using AI to organize sources. Great. I think most of us are pretty divided here, it looks like. I think this very first one, reading shortcuts, is maybe the most one-sided in terms of bad. People are okay with having it generate summaries based on notes. Awesome. Look at how divided all of these uses are. Yeah. Writing a whole paper with no student editing. I'm glad. I have had so many times where there isn't unity on this one, and that's horrifying. But look, we're getting some real unity on some of these. But also, what about this, right? Writing in your native language and having LLMs translate to English. That's a very real like dilemma that ELL students will find themselves in regularly. And look at how unclear this is. 60 people have already responded to this. Dang. All right, let's get back to the presentation right now. So ultimately, let me move this. Presenter view, F11. Great. Ultimately, I think what comes out of that survey is that there is a huge lack of clarity, right? We had 60 people fill it out. And on that question about using translate AI to translate, for example, it was almost even thirds in each group, right? There is a ton of uncertainty around what is and is not okay to do with these tools right now. And honestly, that can be pretty disorienting. But I also want to throw out there that this puts you in really good company. Namely, it puts you in the same. I will absolutely share those survey results later. I don't mind. Yeah, I'm absolutely glad to do that. But great question there, by the way. But anyway, there's a lot of this uncertainty. And you know who this actually puts you in a similar in company with? Your students, right? Because 2026, it's hard to be a student. It's weird to be a student. And as a millennial, I'm very inclined to think to my own student days and be like, well, my times were hard and unclear and bad too. Some teachers didn't allow devices. And hey, I think there are some lessons we can glean from that. But I think it's important to lead with humility and realize we're getting older, right? Like my students' experiences are not mine. I don't know what it's like to go to college after a giant pandemic. And my students entering college right now, we're in 6th grade or 7th grade, depending, when the pandemic hit. That's huge, right? So some student realities I want to talk about here. First, also let me get this box out of the way. I think that was probably annoying. Great. So right now, it's really hard being a student. So I have a bunch of citations here. This first one, this Kedzierski et al. Study, this is specifically a study done by the CU Boulder Center for Teaching and Learning, where they interviewed about 10% of CU students and just went over the data. And a thing that kept coming up was how unclear the lines are. I might have 5 different classes in the same day that each have a total different approach to AI. That is not ideal. Also, there's tons of evidence about worsening mental health, especially post-pandemic. Part of this is also that our diagnostic tools have gotten better, but still, this is a real issue. Beyond that, our students are dealing with real worsening economic conditions. Almost all of my students are working more right now than my students were a decade ago. And like it or not, that has an impact on what they can bring to the classroom. But setting aside the present tense, there's also way worsening economic prospects, largely fueled by these AI tools students are trying to get a handle on, right? A lot of them are getting degrees not knowing how they'll land a job. Beyond that, COVID's huge and multifarious impact is still being figured out, right? Every news study that comes out with this finds some other new correlation to some other learning outcome or learning deficit from these issues. I could do a whole talk on any one of these bullet points because it truly has changed a lot and gotten less stable for students. That's ultimately the real feel that I keep getting from students when I interview them is they want to do well, but they don't even know what doing well means. They felt underserved coming out of middle school and high school because of the pandemic. They came straight to college and it's messy. Things are messy right now. Again, I've done 2 recent talks on this with the Learning Design Group. I'd really recommend both. This first one, CDS 29, this was one where we kind of got a bunch of stereotypes that faculty had given us, and we went and interviewed a bunch of student support professionals and looked at data and tried to interrogate some of those stereotypes. And then CDS 26, this was actually one co-created with a bunch of students. I wanted to hear what they expected out of college in the next year. And I think both of these talks could be kind of worth your time if you're curious. The recordings are linked in the talk. But again, it's rough being a student right now, but that's not the only place it's rough. Spoilers, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, it's rough being a teacher right now too. Both sides of the desk have real crises they're dealing with. So looking at the other side of the desk, it suddenly feels like our classroom has just changed overnight under our feet. Really quickly, all assessment types that we had spent generations developing suddenly became vulnerable. You have people doing these return to blue books, and even that I think is idealistic, right? Smart glasses are $200 a pop. They're not much. And I personally have not seen a single academic integrity policy that deals with smart glasses. What do we do? What do I do if I'm giving a blue book exam and a student shows up with smart glasses on that has prescription lenses in? So I can't make them take it off. It's an accessibility concern. But also, those smart glasses would absolutely be problematic for an exam. How do I navigate that? Right? We do not have great solutions yet, and that's terrifying. Also, our workloads have increased and transformed. Sure, AI has made a few specific things easier. I generally think that's true. My lesson planning, for example, when I have a ghost chat GPT, I have a notebook LM folder ghost version of every class that I teach that it's really great to be able to talk to and ask questions. Hey, my students struggled with X concept. Can you highlight every place to me in the syllabus that I bring that concept up? And then I can go through the schedule and figure out where I can, add more references or whatever. That's really useful. And I could have done it before, but it would have taken more time. So there's lots of ways these things have made things a little easier, but they've created a ton of work. Suddenly I need to know a ton about AI just to be able to run my class. Also, it's never been more unclear how our students are doing their work. And again, that matters. I don't care about the product. I care about that process. And if I don't know how they're processing it, that's a problem. This is actually kind of a cornerstone concept of another talk I do called the AI grief cycle. That's all about how faculty are experiencing this. And I would really encourage you to go take a gander. I've done both the training on it, linked here, and also I did a podcast for the teaching and higher ed folks, linked here. I think both are pretty good, but if you're faculty, none of this is news to you. It probably just feels like I'm preaching to the choir, but mostly I just want you to know that I get it. I'm there. I'm dealing with these things in my classroom too. So where does that leave us? Well, leaves us in a place where we have to take a harm reduction approach, right? What are people actually doing and what do we have control over? And let's just have a few reality check-ins here. First, the research is pretty clear. Our students need us to guide them here. Lower AI literacy leaves anyone extremely vulnerable to scams, to misinformation, or just to giving up too much of their cognitive sovereignty to these tools. But higher AI literacy has been linked to retaining that cognitive sovereignty and having more skepticism of these things. I should also say, that's from the Tiana et al. Piece, I should say, someone in my reading group would kill me if I don't clarify this, that also the Tiana et al. Piece shows that AI literacy is exhausting, that it makes students mentally exhausted quicker and makes them more likely to make critical thinking errors later. But to me, that still sounds like a muscle where we can give them experience working this out, but that takes practice. They need a trainer for that, and that's us. And that's really the other harsh realities we got to address here. These tools are here and omnipresent. When I first started caring about AI in my classroom back in 2023, their buy-in wasn't as high, right? I reasonably could try to draw some lines on don't do this, don't use this tool, right? But at this point, over 80% of students, at least at CU Boulder, admit to using these tools weekly. Okay, right? That's just a lot. Also, the future of our students and of our careers is being decided right now. I know that might feel like a lot of pressure, and it is. I don't know how to take the pressure off of that. But what it means to be a professor 30 years from now is going to be heavily dictated by what we do in this moment. Also, the cynical thing here to admit, we don't have technological solutions to this. Some things have gotten more reliable and can be part of a solution. I think AI detection is an example of that. But it's not. None of these tools are good enough on their own to be a magic bullet or to be a cornerstone. They themselves take training in how to use, and they can create errors, and that's a whole thing we have to talk about there. And then finally, I just want to say this out loud because I think all of us sort of know this, but I see a lot of what I'd often call waiting. People are waiting for more adults to get in the room. People are waiting for people who know better to tell them what to do. People are waiting for the cavalry to arrive. And I don't know how to say this more bluntly, but there is no cavalry. There are no reinforcements. By total accident and dint of historical moment, we are the cavalry. We are the only people who are going to solve this. So we have to. It's on us. Either we solve this or we drop the ball, but it's us. And look, there are also three things I think we can use as cornerstones for going forward. Sorry, I just saw the chat. There also are some things I want to touch on here for going forward. First, students are using these tools a lot, right? That Kadzierski study really goes in depth. We have other pieces later that go into this, but a lot of students are using them pretty regularly. Secondly, there are better and worse ways to use this. I think that Bastani et al. Piece, where basically a math teacher, created a highly bespoke AI tool for their classroom, and they put a ton of time into it, and they made a tool that actively helped students learn. But also in that same study, any students who had self-guided AI use did about 17 to 20% worse on assessments. Oof. So clearly the consequences can be huge. And finally, though, in a weird thing that keeps coming up, in an opportunity that keeps coming up, is students want training. In every single piece of like data collection I have seen about student sentiment, wanting leadership to guide them has been fairly consistent. So we have stuff that people are doing, even if they're being weird about it and people don't feel comfortable talking about it. We have an activity where there are better and worse ways to do it, and a thing where people want some level of guidance. That just sounds like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Like, I honestly think we can glean some real lessons from the history of sex ed and drug education in America, what worked, what didn't, and our approaches here. And I really want to take a harm reduction approach. I don't want my students being afraid to talk to me about these things, because spoilers, they're still going to use these tools, just now with one less informed person in the room trying to mitigate whatever issues might come up. And that matters, because if they suddenly don't trust me, they're still going to get guidance from OpenAI. They're going to get guidance from Grok. They're going to get any number of posts online that tell them how to really use AI tools. But those things will be free of the skepticism that I would bring. And so me making them terrified to talk to me about this is a loss for both sides. So, by the way, here are the two Gen AI images I had mentioned. Look at that. I didn't make those. I don't have that artistic skill. Yeah. But as we've talked about, there are a lot of crises on both sides of the desk for students and faculty alike, and your policy is an approach towards solving that. So first, there's already high student buy-in with these tools. Okay, that only makes figuring this out more worthwhile as an investment of our time. There are unclear rules and lines. Hey, awesome. This is your chance to clarify some of those lines while also drawing some nuance. And finally, students want guidance. That means there's an opportunity, there's an opening. It's so rare. I have taught for 16 years now. I had to check the calendar. I've taught for 16 years now. I don't remember the last time my students wanted more lessons. Like, that's an interesting opportunity. So what do we do with that? Well, we get policy crafting. That's where we're going. So first and foremost, let's talk about the core features of what make a good AI policy. And I tried to break this into like 6 core features and then other considerations to have. But for these 6 core features, first, I'll be honest, I tried for so long to come up with a good acronym, and the only one I came up with was DICES, and I did not think that was good. But first, define AI. What counts as AI in your course? And obviously, some things are way more obvious than others. Yeah, if you're using Notebook LM, obviously that counts as using AI. But what about if a student is using a translation app that happens to be AI powered? What about something like Gemini, which got added into Google Docs as a replacement for its old spell and grammar correct that now makes pretty ambitious writing suggestions? What about Grammarly? One night, your students went to bed, and Grammarly was just a traditional tree-based architecture grammar spelling app, and they woke up the next day, and after an update, it was an AI tool. Does that count? Right? There are a lot of these tools that students might not even know are AI, or that you could really help clarify some definitions for. Secondly, you need to have clear statements on where the lines are, what is and isn't allowed. But beyond that, you need to be clear where those policies have precedence. Are you creating one global policy for your whole course? Or are you making different policies for different types of assignments or for each individual assignment, right? In my own class, I have very different rules on AI use for peer review versus AI use for writing versus AI use for researching and annotating. Those are different things that have different AI, what I would consider acceptable AI use cases for my students. But I have to communicate that. How? Well, first thing is actually drawing those lines. I also dropped a link here for the Perkins et al. AI assessment scale. If you haven't seen this, I'd really encourage you to click on it right now. They basically do a really good job breaking AI use into 5 categories, color coding it, and it becomes a really easy language you can use to communicate that policy. Hey, if this assignment has a green square in the corner, That means it's level whatever, and this is what you can and can't do, right? Something like this goes a long way. I link their work here because I think it's a really good example, but obviously you have every right to create something in your own classroom that you think fits better. And then also, what about instructions for disclosing AI use? The moment you say you're allowed to use AI in this specific way, you immediately have to start thinking about, how do students tell you that? Do they fill out a form? Do they give you a quick narrative summary? Do you require chat links from ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, right? I was just at Colt, a really cool local ed tech conference here in Denver or in Boulder. And there was a talk I went to by Diane Sieber where she had an AI disclosure form that both was about how they used AI, but also had them taking a quiz that sort of quizzed their, like, how overly or underly reliant on the tool they were. And it gave them essentially like a cognitive offloading score. That's really cool. There's a lot of things you can do here, but you got to do it. You got to actually think it through and come up with a system. The other core features I would define are clear consequences. What happens if students break policy? Do you make an exception if there's accidents? And let me be clear, there will be accidents, right? Just by way of example, I had a student this last semester who turned in a paper for a peer review that was 100% generative AI. And I was furious, right? It's a rough draft, but also the point of a peer review is that everyone's bringing in their rough, raw work together. It must have been awful for the other students in his group that look at this paper that looks done. Like, that's just not necessarily, it's rude, to put it bluntly. But when I met with the student, he was able to prove to me pretty conclusive, like pretty thoroughly, that he had put probably 20 hours of work into this paper already. This was his own work. Just all the way at the very end, he felt not confident in his own writing. So he took it, pasted it in ChatGPT, and just said, make this sound smarter. Is that cheating to me? Right? Like, it's suddenly hearing that whole story, he made the right decision 95% of the time, other than that last pass. Do I want to treat that the exact same as a student who just fully intentionally cheated? I give my students an AI disclosure form where they tell me about their AI use. And then I also use AI detection just to see if it fits with what they have said. The other thing for his, though, was like, I knew this student, right? I had worked him a bunch. It didn't look like any of his rough drafts, right? It looked fully different than his previous rough draft. So again, I didn't accuse him of everything. I reached out to him and had him come to a meeting. And once we were talking, he owned it. That's one of the nice things. When you destigmatize this in the classroom, you can ask questions and get honest answers. But anyway, so those clear consequences. The last thing I want to say here is I'd really encourage you to also consider having a one free pass approach. Misunderstandings are going to happen. Your students are going to they're going to confuse policies from different classes or whatever. Giving students one free pass to help them figure out where the line is really goes a long way. It gets a lot of buy-in, it gets a lot of trust. And also, in my experience, the students who are ne'er-do-well, bad faith actors, they're not going to only make one mistake, right? It's usually a patterned, frequent sort of thing. But beyond that, an explanation as to why. Why is your policy what it is, right? This is important for a bunch of reasons. A, it shows that you're in the know. That savviness goes a long way. If you can talk about AI in a way that makes your students think, maybe I shouldn't try to pass this off as my own work, that matters. Also, this is a chance for empathy. You explaining your concerns around AI. Spoilers, a lot of your students do have similar concerns. And this is a place to build some of those connections. And finally, and I think this is most important, it avoids you seeming arbitrary. And that matters a lot right now, right? I am someone who is deeply skeptical of authority. I've always been. And if I'm in a classroom and someone is just making a policy because it's there to make their life easier versus they're putting together a policy that's meant to help sustain my learning engagement, one of those I'm much more likely to actually follow. And your students are as well. And then finally, the last thing I would touch on here is a faculty AI disclosure statement. However you used AI in your course, however it is, whether it is I used it for a bunch of stuff or I never used it at all, sorry, whether you use it a ton, whether you've never used it at all, that is totally fine. But you should disclose that to your students. The moment you tell your students, oh, hey, FYI, for this unit, I use ChatGPT to clarify the questions on the final assessment, you've made your students less terrified to mention these things. That matters. But looking ahead, I also want to touch on a few other smaller miscellaneous considerations. First, what tools are available to you? This might seem a little silly, but look, I teach at an institution that does have an institutional contract, that ChatGPT, that comes with a bunch of pro features and stuff like that. We also have deals with other ed tech companies and other small apps. But knowing which apps you have access to that you can get training on, that you can get access to special features and all that, that goes a long way. Different schools, again, we have a variety of institutions here. Different schools will have really different sort of tools in their quiver, so to speak. That's mixing metaphors, but whatever. I also want to do a quick note about AI detection here. And we actually have an upcoming talk, and I have a previous talk on this. So please, if you disagree with anything I'm about to say, you can drop it in the chat, or please come to one of these talks. I'd love to talk about it. But generally speaking, over the last 2 years, AI detection has gotten more reliable. You can see it in the data. Russell et al. I mean, literally, they had one app. I'm trying to be vague, so I'm not trying to endorse the company here, but they had an app that had 99.91 accuracy. That's a lot. That's a really high accuracy number. But in an institutional scale, when you still have a few thousand, maybe tens of thousands of students, and they're all turning in dozens of assignments that are going to get scanned, that does mean there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of false reports. And that's a problem. So AI detection on its own, to my eyes, is a really good excuse to have a conversation with a student. It is not really on its own a magic bullet. You cannot just look at an AI detection report and be like, ha, Timmy cheated. But you can look at that AI detection report and say, ha, I got to talk to Timmy about how he wrote this paper. I think that goes a long way. But again, more talks on this in the future. Scrolling down. I will read that question later because that's a long question. But how can also another thing you want to consider in your classroom, how can activities reinforce this policy, right? What are ways you can make the path of least resistance in your class? Being honest. And I found a few things that touch on that. One I really love is group work. The moment you put 4 undergrads in a group together, it's no longer one authority figure lecturing them on what to do. It becomes them as 4 peers having to self-navigate how they do this work with AI tools. Hey, I know the teacher said he was cool with this and this and not this and this. Where do we feel comfortable using these tools? Because their grades are on the line, and they will actually debate those things pretty interestingly. Finally, one of the things I want to touch on is in-class modeling, right? Again, I'll touch on this constantly throughout the talk, but you as a leader in your classroom have the ability to really show your students by example what is appropriate AI use, what are appropriate disclosures, what's appropriate skepticism, all that. I also want to touch vaguely on these last 2 notes, but control versus guidance. If you're creating a policy just because you feel like control is slipping from your grasp and you're just desperately trying to hold on, that's bad. Like that's not going to be particularly effective, and you're going to have to keep tightening your grip over time. And eventually you're just trying to grab water, right? Like it's not going to stay in your fist. But if you're making a policy that is instead meant to help guide your students on how they can and can't use these things, and you're sort of framing it and viewing it through that lens, you can do some pretty positive work. The other thing I want to touch on here, is this value arguments for your content. And I'm someone from the classics, right? My background is in classics and humanities generally. I have gotten very comfortable having to defend why my class matters. But I actually think in this moment, this is one of the biggest defenses that we can have in our classroom. If your students think that your content is valuable, they are a lot less likely to cut corners. So that kind of leaves us this next question, though. Well, first, it brings us these example policies. These are all linked in the chat. Here's my own policy. Here's the annotated text of my syllabus. Here's an actual training I did for the e-learning consortium of Colorado, going over my approach. Here's that published article I gave, but also here's some other faculty whose work I really respect that I just wanted to endorse here, right? This is Dr. Flux, a psych professor here, and he has this video explainer explaining his AI policy through the metaphor of Van Gogh's career in a way that students really resonate with, and he gets huge buy-in. Or also scrolling down, if you have a class where you really trust your students and it's maybe a smaller workshop-y thing where you want it to be more collaborative, you might consider co-designing your policies. The very bottom here, I have Nikki Jobin's approach. She's a history professor here at CU Boulder, and she does awesome work. And she has a whole write-up here about how do you talk to your students about this? How do you co-create? How do you begin co-creating a policy with them? At the bottom, I also have Jason Guglio's approach. Jason hasn't written a specific art. He's a professor at Berkeley College. He's a huge name in this field, but he has not written one specific article on this, but this is an interview he gave to Stephan Bouchard about how he manages this in the classroom. And I really think that if you're someone who's interested in that approach, because spoilers, if your students actually have a hand on designing the policy, they're so much more likely to play by it. They had their hand on the ball. They care more about this. They see the point more. And I think that has been true, generally speaking, in my experience. So again, 2 links down there to some different approaches for how you can get some co-creating policy. But that kind of leads this question of like, hey, Chris, what should my policy be? Maybe you're someone wondering that. And I want to tell you, I don't know, right? It's not my role to tell you your policy. Look, the fact is, you're the expert. I trust your expertise here. I trust that all of you know your classroom, your material, and your students better than I do. I'm just a guy. I know my classroom, my material, my stuff really well. I know AI really well. I'm happy to like get coffee and chat with you about it and give you a bunch of info so you can figure all that out. But generally speaking, these are things you have to figure out on your own. But I can give you some guiding questions. So first, whatever you do, it's going to require understanding these tools. If you are radically anti-AI or radically pro-AI or anywhere in the middle, any of those really informed approaches is going to take AI literacy. If you're trying to keep these things out of your classroom, you need to know what they can do. Also, questions I want to throw out there: what do your peers and colleagues do? If someone else has taught a similar section of a course you're teaching, what did they do? What's your department or university doing? Is there policy coming along? What's your gut instinct? Everything else falls apart. Let's say you have no answers to any of those previous things. A big part of my advice would be start with what you think about this. Which of these uses feels more or less ethical to you? There's nothing wrong with building policy and then iterating as it does or doesn't work. Spoilers, that's been the core of teaching since Socrates. And then beyond that, one thing I do want to push here is you should really try to avoid self-guided use, right? The literature is pretty clear that self-guided student AI use is pretty consistently bad, right? Not for every student, but a lot of students will self-guide towards a lot of offloading and a lot of corner cutting. That is actually cognitively important. Not every student, but most. Also, one last thing I want to say here, but this might seem silly. What's actually enforceable? I can't tell you the number of policies I have worked with faculty where their policy is just not, it's not real, right? No student in my class can use AI to study at all. How do you enforce that? To study? Are you watching their internet traffic? Do you have like is Proctorio watching them sleep, right? Like, I don't understand how you'd actually enforce that. And when students hear that sort of policy that is unenforceable, what they often perceive it as is, A, this person is out of touch, and B, this person has no idea like what I'm going to do with these tools. You really want to avoid that. It's a little hard, but you really do need to be honest with yourself of what is actually enforceable. So even though I can't tell you specifically what your policy should be, you can go through, and we do have a worksheet for that. So jumping forward to this next thing, I see a lot of discussion in the chat, by the way, about AI detection. I am absolutely glad to drop a bunch of articles in there when I'm done. But yeah, glad to do that. It's not that I haven't seen those things. It's just that if I suddenly start talking about AI detection, you have my word, I don't get this talk done. But over here on the right, I have the QR code again to this, and I'm going to drop this link in chat again. Whoa, there's that link. But I want you to go take a second and just start working on this, right? This is a policy jumpstart activity. This is a worksheet that I often work with faculty to help them. Honestly, the whole point of it is just having you take your thoughts and your fears and your anxieties and your hopes and all that you have about AI and put it on a piece of paper, and then take that piece of paper, Mad Libs style, and just sort of cut it together into a policy. I want to be clear. I do not think the policy that you would make here is a final draft by any stretch. It would be very clunkily worded. It would definitely it would feel really formulaic. But if you go through this worksheet, fill it out, and then just move the things from those boxes into those correct sections, you at least have a rough draft policy. So that's sort of the goal with this one. For the sake of time, I am not going to student self-guided use often leads. I mean, to be fair, I push back against the framing of a crutch just for like ableism reasons, but also that isn't totally what the research shows, right? I mean, some students are absolutely doing that. Some of them are doing, like, we are not better than our students. I'm not. If these tools came out when I was 16, 100%. If you told me, Chris, you could spend an hour doing your homework or 40 minutes doing your homework and you get to go hang out with your friends, I get it. They're making very normal middle school and high school age learner decisions that these tools are capitalizing on, right? I don't even want to problematize them. A lot of them learn these bad habits, then they get to college and things are too big, too scary, and the stakes are too high, right? I had a student that I caught dead to rights in a plagiarism case with AI. And I gave her this whole condescending talk about how the core of learning is risk. And she looked me dead in the eyes after and said, sure, but my parents took out a mortgage to put me in this class. Do I risk our home because I didn't understand this concept? That's a big question, right? Like these issues, like these tools are bringing education into conflict with other very real issues in our nation, in our world. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. I got distracted by a comment. I gotta be better. This worksheet, go ahead and take that, open it on your own, make a copy and start filling that out. I think there is a lot there. So moving on. What to do with the policy once you have it. So once you have it, first things first, you got to communicate that policy. And how do you communicate it? First, put it everywhere. In my class, my syllabus has a giant policy statement on it. Then there's also a separate explainer page on my LMS that has a video of me talking about it. There's in-class conversations and activities. There's an announcement that go out basically anytime there's like a paper coming up. There's also a discussion post that comes up where students are graded, discussing and debating and trying to improve the policy. And then finally, at the end, when the assignment prompts get put out, every single one of them has a reminder about the AI prompt or the AI policy. That's a lot. It's annoying. It's redundant. But look, there's a lot of benefits to that approach. It draws really clear lines. My students are anxious about those lines. They're a lot less anxious now. But it also removes, from my point of view, it removes plausible deniability. I could believe a student doesn't read the syllabus. I can believe that they missed an announcement, but it's a lot harder to believe that they also missed that in-class discussion and that graded discussion post, right? Me putting it everywhere means I can actually expect it to be played along with. I like it also because it opens up your class with a collaboration rather than a challenge. A lot of students will see the no AI ever approach as a challenge. I also like this because it's multimodal. Look, all those things I just listed, some are audio, some are video, some are text, some are interactive, right? All of those are different types of learners. And I think that this approach just gives everyone a fair shot. Again, it also shows that savviness, which goes a long way. Your students thinking you know a lot about this, for some students, especially for potentially bad faith actors, could change their calculus. Also, last two things, I like that it returns a little bit of that student agency. A thing that keeps coming up when I talk with my students is how alienated they feel from their own education, as though it's a roller coaster ride. I think this gives them a little bit more of a hand back on the ball. And then finally, it creates space for AI literacy, right? I can't start teaching my students about the fears and concerns and anxieties and limitations of these tools if I can't get them to admit how they're using these tools. As for implementing policies, again, some of this is a little repetitive, but model it. Give your own disclosure. Admit the things that you don't know. Discuss your hopes and anxieties around AI. That will absolutely change the way your students are discussing these things in class. Also, lean into having awkward conversations. Look, you cannot assume a student cheated from any one data point, whether it's a weird revision history, a bad AI detection report, or whatever. But if you start conversing and talking about those things, you can start to get a narrative of how those papers were created a little more organically. Also, it's important to hold students accountable, right? This, especially when they co-create this policy, it becomes an agreement that you're able to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page of. I also would really encourage you to be empathetic. It's hard to be a student right now, and it's hard to be a teacher right now, and approaching these things with that humility really goes a long way for both parties, I've found. Mistakes are going to happen. I've made mistakes. I'm not perfect. You wouldn't believe it. They invite a not perfect guy to lead one of these talks, but your students also aren't perfect. And then also, I encourage, again, that second chance policy, but it needs to be clearly delineated. If you are going to give your students, like, you get one mulligan on the AI policy, that should be very clearly stated. What you don't want is a student who thought, like, well, I just get to keep figuring out the line or whatever. And then finally, again, I'm just going to put this sort of phrasing there at the end. Make engaging in good faith with your policy the path of least resistance. If you make it easy to be honest, your students will be. Many of them will be. And that's nice. And then the ones who aren't, like, pedaling along the policy, then you can focus your vision a little more on those students. So conclusions, hey, things are hard for everyone right now. And a big part of that is those unclear lines and policies. There's an opportunity, though. Students want guidance, and that creates an opening for us. And clear and reasonable policies can solve problems for both parties. Also, effective policies need really clear lines, a stated rationale, procedures, and some sort of definitions. I also want to hit on this iteration note. You are going to make mistakes. I include in my pack, like this link I'm putting out later, my failed initial AI policies. I want you to see that iteration is fine. I thought this policy would totally work. It did not. Womp womp. That's okay. Back to the drawing board. In-class changes are needed to support new policy, just so you know. Like getting a great policy built, if you're not actually designing around it in class and actually reinforcing it through classroom culture, it's just really a hope and a dream still at that point. And again, being redundant and multimodal can help really explain your policy. And finally, I would encourage you deeply to involve your students in this discussion and making it easier. Getting students involved generally lowers the thresholds just around the board in my experience. So we're almost to the Q&A. I see the chat going crazy, but I also want to touch on some resources really quick. First, the very top here is Lance Eaton's AI policy syllabus statement repository. This is literally a repository of like thousands of syllabus statements on AI from around the world. There's a ton of evidence there, a ton of examples. If after this, you're like, I hated everything Chris said, but I want to find someone else who has a different approach, you will find it there. I could not promise that more. Underneath that is, I'm linking again the Perkins et al. AI assessment scale. I just think this is valuable, and I really think this is a good starting point for a lot of people designing their first policy. Underneath that is also the survey results for that Kedzierski et al. Piece I mentioned, the one that's meant, is interviewing 10% of CU students. And then, as I said before, good teaching is community, right? It's a bunch of us older people trying to help younger people figure out the world, and us older people have been stealing from each other and building on each other's approaches forever. So I encourage you to find some communities. Top one here is the Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group. They're I'm in the Rocky Mountain region, so they're a local big consortium of like local people who know a lot about AI. It's really great, and I love just getting to chat with them. It has helped inform my approach so much. Beneath that is the AI and Ed listserv. This is a giant Google group, and it's international. And I mean, I'm sure a few people from that group are here. Hey, everyone. You should join this. This is free, and I get so much information from this basically every day. And then finally, me, right? Like, hey, you can click on that. It'll just send me an email. But I'm glad to help however I can, right? You have questions about this presentation or about maybe I mentioned something you want to follow up on, drop me a line. I'm glad to chat. And also, I'm providing a link here to a folder of resources that I regularly share with faculty. I refer to this as my Mosaic approach starter kit because that's what I named my approach. But it's just kind of a crash course with a few of the resources I use. And they're all annotated as to why I built them the way I did. And I just hope it's a good starting point for people. So that's that. Now we're done. Now we're in the Q&A. Let's go. I will stop the share now, I suspect. And let's get some Q&A questions going.
All right. Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to go through the ones in Q&A. We have about 5 minutes, and then we'll go back to chat if we have any extra time. But please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to all that we can. There was a question earlier. I know you talked a little bit about, are there any things that you created in AI for this talk that you did not disclose that we think we should disclose to everyone here?
In this talk? So in this
Yep.
talk, the only, like I said, I reviewed it when I put that AI statement up front. There are the 2 AI generated images on slide 12. And then I do think some of the linked resources I created, like my AI disclosure statement, for example, I did have ChatGPT remove. You wouldn't believe it. I'm a redundant, wordy guy. So I did have ChatGPT help me with just like editing it down so it fit to a page. But I mean, we're talking about it edited under 20 words of that form, probably. I think the rest of it should all be Chris made. I can't think of, it's all organic, homegrown, artisanal course content.
Great. Thanks. Okay. Many tools have quietly integrated AI under the hood, but haven't disclosed it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I hate it, right? I mean, they're literally going against the core concept of what I'm pushing here, that ethos of transparency. I really hate the example I keep coming back to is Google Docs. They changed the way their spell check works. So it's Gemini based rather than being a traditional like tree based architecture for spell check and grammar check. Fun fact, it's measurably less accurate from some of the research I've read. But also, I really wish they would disclose that. I wish when they make those big updates, I would like to know that as a consumer. But yeah, I'm not a fan of those surreptitious AI additions, we'll say.
Thanks. So the next question says, curious on your thoughts on departments having a shared policy versus leaving it up to individual instructors.
Yeah, I mean, I think I am more supportive of policy when it gets more small grain. I do think a university-wide policy is really hard, right? Like I, as someone teaching writing, I have very different needs than someone teaching computer science, than someone teaching marketing. But I do think when you get to department level, you can start getting some agreed upon lines, maybe. I won't be surprised if down the road we see departments start having like different tracks, right? But that could be useful. Part of the frustration here is it kind of depends how much we're really asking faculty to pay when, how we're asking faculty to do when their plates are already full. I don't know about the 114 faculty in this room. I'm sure, but how many of you have like spare time to kill where you couldn't, you just have nothing better to do, you know? And I think that is nice. If departments come up with a policy that really does work for their discipline, that's great. But I personally have not seen that as much, but I'm hopeful that that's the direction things will head.
This question says, do you reach out to industry to understand their expectations from fresh graduates? Job nature changing means exam nature changing. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I do. So that's a very funny question. That is literally part of the reason that I run an AI reading group because my AI reading group is one third faculty from CU, one third, roughly one third people outside of CU, and then roughly a third of people who do not work in academia. This is people working in law around AI. This is people who are devs, right? I have the CTO of an AI company in the group. I have people who work for local labs around Boulder who are there just to tell me what they wish their students had known when they hired them, right? And yeah, 100%. This is a problem that comes with. This is a crisis that has different, unique problems in every facet. And I kind of think the only way to approach it is this holistic, like I'm asking everyone. But yeah, I do. For whoever asked that question, I do try. Right, I can only talk to so many people, but I do try to leave that door open as much as I can.
Okay. Do you think there's a good job prospect out there for AI for education teachers?
So are we talking about for people who teach AI literacy and stuff? Yeah, I think so. Right. If you're someone who teaches like introduction to healthy and safe AI use and AI literacy at some university, yeah, I actually think that's one of the things I'm least worried about going away in the next like decade because as these tools get more and more integrated, it does feel like universities are slowly starting to really lean into that needing to be a thing they teach. I also think there's clear use for that in the private sector, right? I mean, there are tons of private companies I'm aware of that are hiring AI literacy experts just to keep their employees informed and up to date with best practices and stuff.
So I know we only have a minute officially left. Chris has agreed to stay on for a little bit longer to answer some more questions. But if you have to drop off, we totally understand. Um, and we appreciate you being here. And hope you will come to our next session and be sure to look for the slides and video when we have those ready. Okay.
I also wanted to say really quick that I did have the participants list up for a moment, and I saw a few names I recognize as like people who have been deeply impactful in my career in a variety of ways. And I just want to say thank you. I've been told that I can't call out specific names, so I'm not going to. But if you're someone here and you're like, oh, I'm going to go see how this old kind of protege sort of person of mine is doing, thank you for showing up. That meant a lot, and I will drop you a line later. But anyway,
All right. Next question. So they say, I want to be open to AI use, but it comes down to this question. How do we protect our intellectual property in any scholar's work that we share in class? Example, students take the assigned readings and generate a summary. Now those scholars' works are teaching AI without the scholar's permission.
I mean, so I I could not agree more there, but I also think part of that battle is already done, right? Like that scholarship is already almost surely in those training engines. Those publishers, many academic publishers have already signed deals with Anthropic, with OpenAI to give access to their research repositories as training data, for better or worse, right? Like my article, the one that I link at the beginning, that has been uploaded to AI, not by me, and that's just the reality. I don't know if I'm as worried about my students being disrespectful with work as I am of like other people, frankly. But I do see your point there, right? But I also would encourage maybe having that be part of the discussion with your students. If you are the most concerned about property rights or intellectual property rights, lead with that. Your students will have thoughts on that. I can be super like confident in that. When I talk about these things in my classroom, my students are, many of them are more cynical about that sort of thing than I am. And so leading with that could be a great way to build some of that community and maybe start discussing what do we do in class around this.
All right. The next one says, what is the most surprising usage of students using AI in the classroom despite your clarifications?
I guess if we're, let me think. I want to give both a positive and a negative. For a positive, I had a student who was an ELL student who was using, he had created this extremely complicated workflow with three different LLMs, where what he was doing was he was pumping his papers at different stages through each one, but never having it rewrite for him and instead having it give him one was always giving him grammar explainer notes. One was always giving him like related. He'd uploaded every course reading to it, which we could go back to that last question, but whatever. And he had basically like have that one run his paper against all the readings. And the third one was just like an emotional support one. But on some level, I found myself surprised how deeply thorough this was. This is not lazy, right? The lazier thing is just having a paper write it or an app write it for you. This is more work. This student was putting in more hours, I would suspect, than the average student. So I think that was one where I think the student got a lot of what they wanted out. They got the emotional yay of from that third chat, but also these other two that were giving real constructive feedback, and they would share the links with me so I could chime in. In terms of bad use cases, I will say once you start having your students turn in your AI chat logs, you will see some wild questions. One of the things that horrifies me that I see by far the most is students asking, what should I think about this? Or what should I respond to this? Or should I like this? I see that a lot. And I think that is one of the scariest questions I can see in a chat log, right? Like, I don't need you to like all the poetry I signed. Spoilers, sometimes I don't like it. I assign it because that's kind of the fun. But if you can't look at a thing and have that gut reaction, that's scary to me. But I also think that getting those students, now that I know that student is using those tools that way, I can intervene. I can start saying like, okay, no, we're doing laptops closed. We're doing like an in-class response exercise. I can start creating exercises to try to re-bolster some of those muscles.
The next question is a student looking for a job. They're wondering if they want to transition to a job related to AI in classroom settings. Is there anything that you would recommend that they focus on for that transition?
So yeah, I mean, I actually think this is a pretty decent timing to be trying to do that, right? I've seen a number of different centers for teaching and learning around America hiring like student or postback or postdoc interns who are trying to fill that gap. There is a huge, I also actually, depending on how close you are from graduation, I would probably put a lot of emphasis on how close you are to still being a student in that. The emphasis really being on how AI impacted your student journey, because that's really one of the missing keys. I was never a student when AI existed. I can in my head sort of imagine it and like role play out how I would have handled it. But you having real practical experience of like, yeah, I had to learn how to use AI this way because when I did it this way in a class, I did way worse, and then I started doing this. That that actually is really valuable intel that you probably could leverage into some sort of like entry level position, whether it be in student support, some sort of tech position, AI, integration specialist. There's a bunch of different titles that are emerging now, but I think that personal experience you have is actually probably pretty valuable.
Okay, we have 4 questions left, if that's okay with you, Chris.
I love it. I'm happy to talk. Go ahead.
Okay. I teach reading and writing intensive courses. I'm curious to hear how you approach your AI policy differently for different parts of the writing process and what your rationale is for accepting higher and lower levels of AI use.
Yeah. I mean, whoever asked that, I would encourage you to drop me a line because that itself could be a whole talk. So feel free to email me and we can like have a deeper conversation. But for me, part of it is like the research shows different levels of disruption with some of those tools. I want my students to know how to do research on their own, for example, but also there's nothing wrong with them doing research on their own while also they have ChatGPT doing a deep research query for 20 minutes while they do their own research. They come back with their own corpus of research and ChatGPT has found them probably a handful of things they wouldn't have found. And like that sort of approach, that doesn't bother me as much as long as they're still doing their own research with it. Right. But that's very different to me than, say, something like peer reviewing, where the point of peer reviewing is to get another human being's eyes on it. And at the end of the day, I also like to view this through the lens of value added. If I take a student's rough draft and I put it through ChatGPT, take the notes and give it back to them, what have I done for them that they can't do for themselves? Right. But if I take their paper, put my notes on it from my dumb brain, and I put it on there and give it to them, that is something they could not have done on their own. Right. And so that's why I'm a little more guarded there. When it comes to writing, right, this is part of the reason, like, once my students are honest about how they're actually using these tools in composition, we can start actually setting some pretty clear best practices. If you wrote this whole paragraph and then you run it through ChatGPT specifically with a prompt about reducing wordiness, and your paragraph that comes out is basically the same, except it's got like 12 different words, I'm not going to find that as dishonest. Like, that to me is pretty reasonable. And it's not that different than the way people treated human editors back in the day. It's just not a human. But that is wholly different to me than a student just generating a whole paper. Right. And like part of the problem is the granularity here. Our students are cutting these tools into every step of their process. And annoyingly, you're going to have to start like having policies for every step of that process.
All right, thanks. Okay. There's a discussion earlier in the chat about AI detectors and CU policy on that, and how
I,
there's
s-
not
I
really
s-
one recommended. But
yeah, and I
the
saw
question here is,
our AI guru answering a bunch of those questions.
yeah, what AI detectors do you recommend, personally?
So again, I'm not necessarily here endorsing a private product or a product privately or anything like that, but I generally use two. I personally use GPT-0 and Pangram because the data on both them kind of shows them to be opposites. Pangram generally has more false negatives. And I mean, in some of these studies, I believe the Russell one that I mentioned, I believe they had zero false positives and 60,000 data points. That's great. GPT-0 tends to go the other way. It tends to have more false positives, but way fewer false negatives. And I've often found that if I run a piece through both, I can get some level of like seeing where that overlap is, right? If both of them think that this is AI written, that can be really telling. It's also worth saying that I'm never using AI detection holistically as its own thing. I'm comparing it to their AI disclosure form. They fill out a form where they tell me how they've used AI, and I'm just trying to compare and see if what they said matches up with what I see in the report.
All right. What do you recommend for exams? Classic Scranton or pencil paper? Are there other good approaches for STEM classes?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I want to be like the literature on that is still really coming out. One of the articles I put in there was actually a lit review of this is on for the person who asked that. Sorry, this is on the uh, 2026 Classroom Realities: How Being Faculty Has Changed. I have that Ali and Marulis piece that's on all assessment types suddenly being vulnerable. And that's a literature review where they're looking at a few dozen different articles that have reviewed a variety of different assessment types. I would say my approach has been to make my approach or make my assessments really different from each other. Some are more written, some are more presented, some are one-on-one conversations, some are full class, some are a video, right? But just having these different sorts of artifacts that students are creating, if nothing else, like this is a very cynical thing to say, but if nothing else, I'm showing that they have that level of AI mastery that they can at least make good products in multimodality. But also, I think it's hard to actually get away with it on all of those. If you're truly outsourcing all of the work, I think it's hard to do it in every modality like that. But also, the one thing that is sort of holding up is again that oral assessment. If I have students one-on-one come to office hours and present to me why they put together a paper the way they did, never present, they just talk to me about it, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly. I actually think one of the big tells of over reliance on AI is actually an inability to really talk about and navigate your work. Right. This happened in my own AI reading group. We had a person who attended who clearly was relying on AI summaries for it. And they did not remember whole articles that they had like read up supposedly. And like that's telling to me. But again, I want to be clear, there isn't one magic solution. And whoever asked that question, I'd love you to reach out to me and tell me what you're doing because I'm looking for ideas.
Okay. Um, Next question says, I teach several classes on Gen AI where I'm teaching students the new ways of designing software with AI. I still have some assignments
Exciting.
where I do not allow the usage of AI, whereas in others, I expect that they use AI. Some students have a hard time switching off AI on those assignments. How do I navigate this balance?
I mean, first of all, I want to say I really love that you're doing that because I will say, yes, you're probably getting a lot of pushback off the people who are like, I don't want to have, why do I have to do this like by hand? Like by hand. I'm sure you're not having them handwrite code, but still, that is going to preserve some of their skills in a real way for this, even if they hate it. In terms of how I would actually enforce it, like I would probably use some amount of class time for that, even just getting it started. Even if it is like, okay, we're going to spend 15 or 20 minutes at the end of class getting this project started in groups, that could be a good step. But also, this is a great place where that group work thing really comes into play. If I tell my students, no, for this specific assignment, I would prefer no AI use. That is the policy to complete this for an A. If I have one student, they might be like, I'm going to see if he catches me. If they have four students, that one student has to convince a group of four people to take that risk, and that's much harder. And so that might be one of the approaches I take there too.
Okay, so our last question. Um, how do you find developing AI policy for online only classes where it's a bit
Oh,
more difficult to have honest and real conversations about AI policy?
hey, absolutely. I literally just finished my entirely asynchronous class for the summer like a few weeks ago, right? I do, like I said, I teach entirely async classes as well as in person. And I think my approach to this is really leaning into instructor presence the whole class. Like, first of all, if you are teaching an asynchronous class where you're not particularly present, I actually think there is no way to really do this well. But for me, I'm posting a short what I would call a lo-fi homework update video every week, as well as probably one more well-produced lecture video. I'm shooting out short little videos regularly when I have questions or concerns or qualms about papers. I'm inviting students to office hours. And then that presence gives me a platform upon which I can actually start discussing policy, even if it is asynchronous. You're totally right. In an asynchronous classes, there are just some students who are going to drift. There are some students who are not going to care about the policy that I set up. There are some students who are just there to get this check mark done and get out. And I can't control that to a degree, right? This is something that Trisha Bertram Gallant in The Opposite of Cheating refers to as enrolled persons. Like at the end of the day, there are just some people who, because of their job or their life or whatever, are going to be in this class that you're not really going to be able to give them too many incentives. But I also think that you therefore can't really hold your, like, you should do your best to reach out to them, but not drive yourself crazy. Aim for what you can do to get the majority of students on board. And I think a big part of that is, again, building instructor presence early and frequently in class.
Thank you, Chris. We want to thank you so much for being here today and for this great talk.
Thank you all for taking some time to care and to learn and to like put the effort in. Thank you.